Well, shalom, my name is Todd Bennett, and this is the audio-video recording of the weekly Shema Yisrael Newsletter titled Joseph and the Messiah. This was originally published on day 11 of month 12 on the Creator's calendar, also known as March 4th, 2023 on the Roman calendar. Of course, March is named after Mars, the Roman god of war. It's just another reminder of the fact that we're living under the veil of Rome. Did you know that a statue of Mars stands outside the United States Congress, the branch of government that can actually declare war? Also, inside the House of Representatives, the Roman fasces is prominently displayed behind the speaker's podium. The fasces is the symbol of Roman power. And why would the United States of America be displaying these Roman symbols in their capital filled with Roman architecture? Is it simply for nostalgia's sake? Well, no. It's because we're still within the fourth beast that represents Rome. The Rome of Yeshua's time was in its infancy stage, even though it was a great empire. It pales in comparison to what it's evolved into now. Now it's expanded throughout the world, and all of these ancient connections with Rome are hidden in plain sight. Imagine that. Sometimes the New Testament scripture seems so distant and remote, but we're actually living under the very same beast system that killed the Messiah, the feet of iron and clay. And that's why the Messiah will return to destroy this same power that we read about in Daniel 2. It says, "As you look, the stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." And this is a wonderful depiction of when the Messiah comes and actually destroys these world powers and establishes his own kingdom and rules from Mount Zion. He'll also be removing some people who moved into his land without permission. And in the last newsletter, I talked about the difference between the Christian understanding of revival versus the scriptural notion of revival. And I mentioned how the dry bones of the house of Israel coming back to life is the ultimate picture of revival, and that has not occurred yet. As part of that discussion, I talked about Yeshua's opening act to his work when he was about 30. We read about that in Luke 3:23, his age, and that started the 40-year generation leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Roman Empire. I thought it'd be good to go back a bit and examine how the text of Luke gets to that point and examine the significance of the event in Nazareth. After the birth of Yeshua in Bethlehem, which is house of bread, the text of Luke describes Yeshua being brought to the temple as an infant, and his parents first attended to his circumcision and then made the required offerings according to the Torah. And we read as follows, "And at the end of 8 days, when he was circumcised, he was called Yeshua, the name given by the messenger before he was conceived in the womb. And when the time came for their purification according to the Torah of Moshe, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to Yahuwah. As it is written in the Torah of Yahuwah, every male who first opens the womb shall be called set apart to Yahuwah, and to offer a sacrifice according to what is said in the Torah of Yahuwah, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons." Now, the fact that they offered birds meant that they were poor. And we know this from the Torah command referenced in Luke. And here's that command. It says, "Yahuwah spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, If a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, as at the time of her menstruation. She shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall continue for 33 days in the blood of her purifying. She shall not touch anything set apart, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as in her menstruation, and she shall continue in the blood of her purifying for 66 days. And when the days of her purifying are completed, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb a year old for burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering, and he shall offer it before Yahweh and make atonement for her. Then she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the Torah for her who bears a child, either male or female. This means that Miriam could not go to the temple for 40 days after the birth of Yeshua. It was then that they offered the sacrifices of a poor person. And that reveals the fallacy of most traditional Christmas manger scenes. Only the shepherds witnessed the newborn Lamb of Elohim. The wise men from the east, carrying gifts of wealth, would not arrive for about 2 years. Interestingly, the parents of Yeshua, although poor at the time, literally brought the Lamb of Elohim that would later be offered up at Passover. While at the temple, they were met by a man named Simeon. Remember, Simeon was the name of the second son of Jacob. He was replaced by Manasseh, the firstborn of Joseph, whose name actually means forgotten. And we read about that in Genesis 48:5. The mention of Simeon was very symbolic with incredible meaning because the forgotten son was adopted by Israel to replace Simeon. And here's the account of the meeting with Simeon as described by Luke. It says, now there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. And this man was righteous and devout, waiting for the comforting, which is Nachom in Hebrew, of Israel. And the set-apart spirit was upon him. And it had been revealed to him by the set-apart spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Messiah of Yahuwah. And he came in the spirit into the temple. And when the parents brought in the child Yeshua to do for him according to the custom of the Torah, he took him up in his arms and blessed him and said, Adonai, now you are letting your servant depart in peace according to your word. 30, according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation, that you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the nations and for glory to your people Israel. And his father and his mother marveled at what was said about him. And Simeon blessed them and said to Miriam, his mother, behold, this child is appointed for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign that is opposed. And a sword will pierce through your own soul also, so that thoughts from my hearts may be revealed. From many hearts may be revealed. Notice he was waiting for the comforting of Israel, not the Jewish people. The nation was still divided and need to be restored. The current state of the house of Yehuda that returned from Babylon was simply a disaster. The priesthood was corrupted, and the declared king, supported by Rome, was an Edomite, a descendant of Esau. That was the Herodian line. They were all Edomites. Simeon must have been saddened by what he saw. People who wept and wailed over the condition of things needed a comforting, for sure. And notice that he referred to Yeshua as a light for revelation to the nations as well. Simeon saw the big picture of what was needed. So Yeshua came for Israel and the nations, as testified by Simeon on the 40th day of his life. Remember that the number has great significance in the scriptures, as it generally refers to a generation of years. As the firstborn, Yeshua was being consecrated, set apart. He belonged to Yahweh, and we read about that in Exodus 13, 1 through 2. Yahweh said to Moshe, consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both of man and beast, is mine. Now, this command was given to Moshe while the Israelites were leaving Egypt after the Passover. By no coincidence, after the account of his birth, circumcision, dedication, and return to Nazareth, the text of Luke then jumps to Passover, when Yeshua was 12 years of age. Again, this account had powerful meaning. They clearly went every year, but Luke jumps to Passover when he was 12 years old. And the number 12 represents the whole house of Israel that needed to be restored. And Passover is how the restoration will occur. And that is what we should all be considering as we approach the Passover. So the text of Luke immediately brings us to that subject after revealing that Yeshua is the lawful Messiah, properly prepared according to all relevant Torah commandments. Here's the account of the Passover provided through Luke. It says, "Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover," and it would have been, they referred to the Passover Seder on day 14, and then the following a 7-day feast of unleavened bread, all comprehensively as the Passover. "And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom, and when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Yeshua stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among the relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem searching for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, 'Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress.' And he said to them, 'Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?' And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Yeshua increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with Elohim and man." His parents went up to Jerusalem every year, so why did the text of Luke fast forward 12 years? And again, the number 12 was obviously symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel. Kol Yisrael. It means all of Israel. And some ascribe the significance of this to his approaching bar mitzvah, but that was more of Talmudic origins. And generally that, I think they're 13 years of age for the Jewish bar mitzvah. The scriptures place significance on a man turning 20 years of age, which numbers 1 through 3. Also, priests would begin their service at 25 and were counted at 30, numbers 4:47 and 8:24 through 26. So the story actually is filled with so much prophetic symbolism. They lost their son, the Messiah, just like the house of Israel lost its relationship as sons. And read Hosea 1 for a refresher course on how the house of Israel fell out of their relationship with Yahuwah, but would be restored as sons of Elohim. The restoration would occur after 3 days, according to Hosea 6, 1 through 2. It says, "Come, and let us return to Yahuwah, for he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us. After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will raise us up, that we may live in his sight." Now remember the promises that he will heal us and he will bind us. Those are promises specifically provided to the house of Israel after they repented to Yahuwah. Now, in Luke, we see Joseph accompanied by his bride returning to Jerusalem after 3 days, finding their son. They went to Jerusalem to find the Messiah, and they found him after Passover, during the Omer count. Can you see all the prophetic pictures lining up here? Well, after the event at 12 years of age, Yeshua returned to Nazareth with his parents, and then there's a gap of 18 years when he was 30. The text of Luke describes John immersing people, and then Yeshua shows up to get immersed at 30 years of age. It says, "And the set-apart Spirit descended in bodily form like a dove upon him, and a voice came from heaven, which said, 'You are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased.'" So the father and the son relationship is firmly established. Yeshua began his father's business at his father's house in Jerusalem. The father provided his consent in the wilderness at the Jordan River, and likely at the same spot where Israel crossed the Jordan under the leadership of Joshua, whose Hebrew name was Yeshua. No coincidence here. Well, clearly the message being conveyed through Luke was to show that Yeshua was beginning to separate from his parents. While the text refers to his father, presumably his adopted father Joseph, Yeshua refers to his heavenly father's business and his father's house. Now the question is, what happened between the ages of 12 and 30? That's a lot of time, 18 years. We know that prior to the Passover story, when he was 12, he traveled from Nazareth, then to Egypt and back to Nazareth. But what did he do during those 18 years? Well, many years ago, I did some research on the Stone of Scone and the traditions of Glastonbury. And there are very interesting traditions about Jacob's stone or Jacob's pillar, the anointed Aben stone, when he was at Bethel. And there are traditions that ended up in Scotland through the travels of the prophet Jeremiah. In fact, you will see that traditional stone being placed under the throne of Charles III in Westminster Abbey. He is to be anointed or Mashiached with oil consecrated at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And that coronation will be scheduled to occur on Shabbat, May 6, 2023, day 30 of the Omer count. And the stone will be brought from Scotland and placed under the throne in Westminster Abbey. Now, there are incredible ancient traditions connecting the United Kingdom to Jerusalem and Israel. And I encourage people to keep an eye on things. The meaning and intention behind being Mashiached with holy oil from Jerusalem and sitting on a throne from the alleged Mashiach stone above the alleged Mashiach stone carried by the tribe of Joseph is really quite profound. Most of the world will be oblivious to what's going on, but not you. These ceremonies may play a part in the future world events leading up to the Messiah's return. And speaking of England, there are also traditions that Yeshua accompanied his great-uncle Joseph of Arimathea, who was a provincial Roman senator and a metal merchant. And did you ever wonder how Joseph could go straight to Pontius Pilate and retrieve the body of Yeshua after his death? We read about that in Luke 23:50-53. Joseph was a wealthy and powerful man, and it was rumored that he owned many of the merchant ships that came to England from Rome and Phoenicia to barter for metal and other goods. And there are traditions that Yeshua accompanied his uncle on these business journeys to the west. Of course, the symbolism of Yeshua traveling with a man named Joseph, being adopted by a man named Joseph as well, and then traveling with Joseph to the end of the earth, which is the extent of the Roman Empire, it's quite profound. While they're only traditions, it's amazing to think that this young shepherd was traveling on his father's business to visit his lost sheep. Interestingly, despite his travels, the text of Luke repeatedly emphasizes Nazareth. In fact, Matthew and Mark each mention Nazareth 4 times. John mentions it 5 times. Luke mentions Nazareth 8 times. As with every detail in Luke, the mention of Nazareth 8 times is purposeful. Of course, 8 is the number of the covenant and represents new beginnings. And Nazareth was not mentioned in the Tanakh because it didn't exist prior to the time of the Maccabees. Nazareth was a fairly new community in the Galilee of the nations. And Yahudim individuals from the south had been transplanted into the northern lands of the house of Israel. And remember that the house of Israel was completely removed by the Assyrians. Their land was then filled with transplants, foreigners from the nations. The Samaritans are one such community that still dwell on Mount Gerizim to this day. And this was standard operating procedure for the Assyrians, who always uprooted and transplanted the people they defeated. It would dampen the patriotism and quell possible rebellions because people would not be prone to fight for a land that was unfamiliar to them. They had no roots or ancestral attachments. The Assyrians also planted officials to oversee the occupation, and trade routes were strengthened, especially by Phoenicians from the north. The Assyrians were later warned of judgment by Jonah. They were allowed to repent, and in fact they did repent. Approximately 150 years later, though, Yah sent the prophet Nahum, also known as Nahum, to pronounce final judgment. Interestingly, the word Nahum means comforter, and there would be no more delays of judgment. Judgment was certain. Nineveh would fall. But the words were not comforting for the Assyrians, but they were comforting to the Yahudim, who witnessed the annihilation of the house of Yisrael. They feared they would be next, and it was very close. The Assyrians were definitely encroaching upon the house of Judah as well. So they were quite trepidatious about the Assyrians, and so when Nahum came and pronounced final judgment, it was very comforting to the tribes of the south that the Assyrians were going to be judged. But history records that the Assyrians were judged by the Babylonians. It was the Babylonians, not the Assyrians, who later judged the house of Yehudah. The Babylonians removed the good figs of Yehudah and left the rotten figs of Yehudah behind, unlike the Assyrians, who removed everybody. And we read about the distinction between the good figs and the rotten figs in Jeremiah 24. And this is how we come to the understanding that the house of Yehudah was represented by the fig tree. Now, as prophesied by Jeremiah, the house of Yehudah was ultimately allowed to return after they were exiled by the Babylonians. Their return was slow and incomplete, though. The Yahudim were regularly under the control of powerful empires. So, in other words, we read in Daniel when Daniel was praying about those 70 years being up and when is this going to happen, and Gabriel gave him the 70-week prophecy. And the Yahudim did not immediately go. Like when that 70 years was up, they didn't immediately return. It took them time to return. Not everybody returned. Well, in fact, only a remnant really returned. And so the return was not very successful. They never set up a king again. Zerubbabel was of the kingly line, but he was always treated as a governor because he had kings over him. So they could not set up a separate and independent kingdom until we see from the time of the Maccabees when they revolted and gained some independence under Hasmonean rule. And that brings us to the Hasmonean king and high priest John Hyrcanus I, who ordered forced conversion or removal of the foreigners in the northern territories and Idumea. So kind of gave a little synopsis of history to get us to that point, that to show that many in the north from Tyre and Sidon, who were those foreigners that had kind of moved into that area, and they were involved in international trade, but they chose to leave because they were not going to get circumcised and convert. And so this left a vacuum that was filled with thieves and robbers that hindered the trade routes. And as a result, the region was later repopulated with Yahudim transplants from the south. So new villages like Nazareth were established with incentives of land and a new life. And it was like America in when they moved west. You know, people moved west and built farms and houses and all that with the promise of a new life. And same thing happened with the Yahudim who moved to the north. And archaeological evidence shows that Nazareth was occupied during the late Hellenistic period, through the Roman period, and into the Byzantine period. So it was relatively new compared to the other inhabited villages, such as Chorazin and Bethsaida. And that is how Joseph, whose lineage was from Bethlehem, ended up in this place called Nazareth, a relatively new and unknown community of settlers. And remember the comment from Nathaniel, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Well, that was the general perception of those frontier towns of settlers in the Galilee. You've heard of the Wild West again, and this was like the Wild North. The Yahudim generally didn't even travel through Samaria because it was so dangerous. So the north was more of a uncivilized, unsettled, unoccupied area, except for the Decapolis cities and Tiberias and other established cities. There was a lot of wildness up there. And those Yahudim settlers were occupying land, and this is an interesting note, they were occupying land that rightfully belonged to the lost sheep of the house of Israel once their punishment period had expired, and we already talked about that period being 390 years multiplied by 7, which was 2,730 years total. So it was, this land was the house of Israel, so that they were expected to come back to after their punishment period was over, but yet these Yahudim were moving in and occupying, and essentially forgetting about their brethren and their brethren's claim. So that's the condition of things when we begin reading the New Testament accounts of Yeshua. And this is the environment within which Yeshua was raised. Now, Nazareth may come from the Hebrew word netzar, and sometimes when a tree is chopped down, a shoot will grow from the stump, allowing a new tree to spring up where the old one has died. In Hebrew, that shoot or that branch is called a netzar. So Nazareth literally means shootville or branchville. And in the last newsletter, we looked at what is commonly referred to as Yeshua's inaugural address at the first recorded synagogue reading in Nazareth. And I thought it'd be good to place that event into context. Well, Yeshua was born in Bethlehem, Ephrathah. He was raised in Nazareth. And of course, as we've said, Nazareth consisted of settlers with a pioneering spirit and a messianic expectation. Their town, after all, was named from the prophecy in Isaiah 11:1 that a shoot, a netzar, would come from Jesse, the father of David. They were on a mission to expand their kingdom that was centered in Jerusalem into the region referred to as the Galilee of the nations. And essentially, this could be classified as tribal creep. They weren't there to maintain it until their lost brethren returned from exile. The house of Yehuda was hijacking the land of their brethren while they were away. And the same attitude and zeal can be seen in Jewish settlers in Israel today. They're on a holy mission to expand because they fervently believe it's their land. And so we can see that history repeats itself. So we see people, they claim to be Jewish, Yahudim, and yet they're expanding all into the northern regions of the modern state of Israel, into Samaria, and they're not thinking of tribal boundaries or Joseph returning. Some are, but not many. They're just saying, hey, it's our land, and we're going to occupy it. So the Messiah, I guess, will work all that out when he returns. But as mentioned, after returning to Nazareth at the age of 12, the text of Luke then jumps forward 18 years to the revival that was being led by John in the wilderness. And it was there that Yeshua was immersed and began his work. And we'll read about that in Luke 3:21 through 23. Now, when all the people were immersed, and when Yeshua also had been immersed and was praying, the heavens were opened, and the set-apart Spirit descended on him in bodily form, like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." Yeshua, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age. Now, the text of Luke describes the immersion of Yeshua at the revival occurring in the wilderness, and this immersion was actually a fulfillment of Isaiah 11. It says, "There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and the branch, the netzar, from his roots shall bear fruit, and the Spirit of Yahuwah shall rest upon him. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge, and the fear of Yahuwah. And his delight shall be in the fear of Yahuwah. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears see, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins." The Spirit of Yahuwah actually rested upon Yeshua after he came out of the water and prayed. So the Spirit of Yahuwah would rest upon a netzar of Jesse. He would be like the anointed or Mashiach David. And the text of Isaiah actually describes 7 spirits as follows. 1, the Spirit of Yahuwah. 2, the Spirit of wisdom. 3, the Spirit of understanding. 4, the Spirit of counsel. 5, the Spirit of might. 6, the Spirit of knowledge. And 7, the Spirit of the fear of Yahuwah. And that is what is represented by the menorah. And the assembly is described in Revelation 1:12-3. Yeshua actually became the fulfillment of the menorah as the light of the world. And that really throws a wrench into the Trinitarian doctrine But I digress. Let's get back to things. After the immersion of Yeshua, the text of Luke then traces Yeshua's genealogy all the way back to Adam. And it's interesting that we've been talking about generations over the past several weeks, and we've been talking about being in the oak tree generation as opposed to the fig tree generation that was judged by Yahuwah through the Romans. As a side note, this week I was considering our homestead in Texas and realized that we have an enormous live oak tree that is centuries old, filled with bees. And remember, Deborah. Bees are called Deborah, representing the word, the bar. And I found that to be incredibly profound and confirming to the message Yahweh has been placing on my heart recently. Well, the question is whether any of you ever took the time to count those generations listed in Luke. Most people simply gloss over them, but I read it and I counted them. There are 77 generations from Yeshua back to Adam, described as the son of Elohim. The text doesn't tell you the number of generations like Matthew does in his gospel, Matthew 1 through 117. You have to first count them to figure out that there are 77 generations listed. And it's really quite incredible because 77 is often viewed as the fullest extension of the number 7. How incredible when we consider Yeshua as the menorah emitting the flames of 7 spirits. 77 is the number associated with the fullest extent of punishment. Genesis 4:24, if Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. It's also used by Yeshua relative to the fullest extent of forgiveness. In Matthew we read, then Peter came up and said to him, Master, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Yeshua said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. The number 77 is linked to the number of elders associated with Sukkot, the culmination of the plan of Elohim to draw the nations back to him. Of course, there's 70 bulls slaughtered during Sukkot, and this is for the nations. You should read the portion of Numbers that tracks the offerings of the 7 days of Sukkot. It starts at 17 bulls on the first day, which represents Yisrael, counting the 2 tribes deriving from Joseph. And it culminates on day 7 of Sukkot with 7 bulls. The bull, of course, is the symbol of Joseph. In Deuteronomy 33:17 we read, his glory is like a firstborn bull, and his horns like the horns of the wild ox. Together with them he shall push the peoples to the ends of the earth. They are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. So Ephraim and Manasseh are the 2 horns of this bull, and they're responsible for spreading the house of Israel and the peoples, the mixing and the spreading all through the ends of the earth. And that is so that Yah can then draw them back. Well, Luke has definitely emphasized Joseph and the Messiah. The 2 sons of Joseph, like I said, are the 2 horns of a bull pushing people to the end of the earth. And have you ever seen a bull up close and personal? And it's interesting, the day before I wrote this message, my wife Janet and I were at a livestock auction in Texas, and a bull got loose while we were in the back checking out the cattle. We were up on the ramparts looking down, and it was really a sight to behold because he was charging and snorting and looking to kill something or someone. So even being up above it all was a little intimidating because you could just sense the power and the fury coming from him. He literally jumped through a wooden gate like it was made of toothpicks, and the power and fury was something to behold. You don't want to get anywhere near those horns, and people run away from those horns when they see them. And Yahuwah created this beast for a purpose. The bull is a powerful animal used to reproduce, and Yahuwah compared Joseph to that beast. And it's through Joseph that the nations will be drawn back to Yahweh. And I hope that you can see how important the house of Israel is to the future plan of Elohim. And I also hope that you can see how significant you are if you're receiving this message, because you're part of it. And that's something that you probably never learned if you grew up in Christianity. You never learned that in Sunday school or heard it preached from the pulpit. Well, now consider something really powerful that can be seen from the genealogy in Luke. Enoch was the 7th from Adam, and Yeshua was the 70th from Enoch. As already stated, the number 70 represents the nations, and this derives from the descendants of Noah listed in the table of nations in Genesis 10. There's 70 descendants from Noah, and so the 70 always represents the nations. And well, guess what? Joseph is listed as the 70th generation from Adam, and Yeshua is the 7th generation from Joseph. So this reveals a significant connection between Yeshua and Enoch. They're both intimately connected to Joseph and the nations. And I'm always trying to emphasize the fact that the nations are the culmination of the plan of Elohim through the covenant and Joseph, the house of Yisrael. And that's why the enemy is desperately trying to confuse and deceive the nations. We could go on and on with this amazing genealogy in Luke, but I'll point out one final item. The 10th generation before Yeshua was Nahum, and the number 10 is closely connected with judgment. The 10th word in the Hebrew scriptures is tohu. So if you read Genesis 1 and continue, you'll get to the 10th word tohu. It means formless and waste. It is the result of the destruction and desolation that comes from judgment. As already discussed, Nahum prophesied judgment and destruction to Assyria, the ones who Yahuwah used to judge the house of Israel. Yeshua would judge the nations who were holding the house of Israel captive. In fact, he will later make that very clear. Well, after the Spirit fell upon Yeshua, and after we are provided with the list of 77 generations from Adam to Yeshua, we are then told that he went into the wilderness. Again, when Yeshua was about 30, it started the 40-year clock for the fig tree generation. It began with a 40-day period of fasting in the wilderness when he was tempted. After those 40 days were up, Luke describes the following. And Yeshua returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and a report about him went out through all the surrounding country, and he taught in their synagogues, being glorified by all. So he did not return straight home right away. He spent time throughout the Galilee, and only after visiting all the surrounding country did he go to Nazareth. And then in Luke 4:16 it says, and he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. Now, in the last newsletter, I mentioned this particular reading in the Nazareth synagogue, but I didn't go too deep into the significance. I mentioned that it wasn't an exact quote, and the event warrants some further examination because it set the stage for his entire work that so many misunderstand. The event wasn't just included in the text of Luke to show that Yeshua could read, and it wasn't there to repeat words previously uttered through the prophet Isaiah. We can all go back and read Isaiah. As we've already seen, everything in the text of Luke has a specific purpose, and there's a much deeper meaning to be gleaned from the event. Yes, with all scriptures, it is imperative to place things in their proper context, and most Western Christians reading this passage have no idea what issue the author was intending to relay. In fact, it's fair to say that many who sat there in the synagogue that day and listened to him failed to understand as well. Yeshua threw a curveball to most of the Yahudim settlers who were expecting a Messiah in Branchville. To this day, he continues to baffle the Jews who claim that he was not the Messiah because he did not unite the two houses, described as two sticks in Ezekiel 37, and restore the kingdom. The Yahudim thought the Messiah was going to come and deliver them from Roman oppression. They had no idea that he came to prophesy judgment on them. And the description of the event in the Nazareth synagogue is presented in a very Hebrew fashion. Whoever wrote the text in Luke surely knew what he was doing. Here again is the text of what occurred when Yeshua visited Nazareth. It says he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of Yahuwah is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of Yahuwah's favor, And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Now consider the structure. 1, he stood up. 2, he was given the scroll. 3, he unrolled the scroll. Now we get to 4, the focal point where he read. And then we go back to 3, he rolled up the scroll. 2, he returned the scroll. 1, he sat down. So that's a very Hebraic way of focusing on what's in the middle. Whenever you see this type of writing, understand that an important message is being transmitted. And to a casual reader, the substance was presumably from Isaiah 61, a favorite messianic text of the Galileans. The problem is this was not a direct quote from Isaiah 61, deriving from the Masoretic text. Here's the substance of Isaiah 61 provided in most Bibles, deriving from the Masoretic text. The Spirit of Adonai Yahuwah is upon me, because Yahuwah has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of Yahuwah's favor, and the day of vengeance of our Elohim, to comfort the home, all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called oaks of righteousness. And that's where we get that oaks of righteousness generation. The planting of Yahuwah, that he may be glorified. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. Strangers shall stand and tend your flocks. Foreigners shall be your plowmen and vine dressers. But you shall be called the priests of Yahuwah. They shall speak of you as the ministers of our Elohim. You shall eat the wealth of the nations, and in their glory you shall boast. Instead of your shame there shall be a double portion. Instead of dishonor they shall rejoice in their lot. Therefore in their land they shall possess a double portion. They shall have everlasting joy. For I, Yahuwah, love justice. I hate robbery and wrong. I will faithfully give them their recompense, and I will make an everlasting covenant with them. Their offspring shall be known among the nations, and their descendants in the midst of the peoples. All who see them shall acknowledge them, that they are an offspring Yahuwah has blessed. I will greatly rejoice in Yahuwah. My soul shall exult in my Elohim. For he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. As a bridegroom decks himself like a priest with a beautiful headdress, and as a bride adorns herself with her jewels. For as the earth brings forth its sprouts, and as a garden causes what is sown in it to sprout up, so Adonai Yahuwah will cause righteousness and praise to sprout up before all the nations. The text of Isaiah 61 is all about Yahuwah's plan for the nations, and the repeated references to double portions clearly directed to the firstborn and Joseph. And everyone in the synagogue knew it. Yahuwah's reading was neither an exact nor a complete reading of Joseph from the Masoretic text, which does not contain the phrase recovering of sight to the blind. Now, interestingly, it's actually found in the Septuagint version of Isaiah. Did somebody remove it from the Masoretic text? Was it too obvious that it referred to Yeshua, who healed many blind people? Remember that the Septuagint predates the Masoretic text by centuries, so that reference was there when Yeshua spoke those words, and then they disappeared sometime later. So there are other variations in Yeshua's reading of Isaiah. For instance, there's a portion brought in from Isaiah 58:6, and other seeming variations that can be understood from examining the Aramaic Isaiah Targum, other Dead Sea Scrolls of Isaiah, and the Messianic Apocalypse found in fragment 4Q521. Some people endeavor to discover whether Luke is filled with errors because the text is not a word-for-word transcription of Isaiah 61. Well, it makes for an interesting study. It really misses the point. You see, that's what Westerners do. They want precision, but that's not how Hebrew thought and custom always operates. There were very specific rules for those reading in the synagogue. And when you were reading from the Torah, you were in the seat of Moses, so to speak. In other words, you stood in the place of Moses, and you were required to read that text verbatim. That's something that Yeshua later confirmed, and Westerners are very comfortable with that based upon their linear thought processes. Well, that's not the case with Yeshua's reading from Isaiah. So what happened? Was it misread in Hebrew, mistranslated by the Aramaic translator in the synagogue? Was it mistakenly written by the author of Luke, or later mistranslated into Greek, or when it was translated into the English? Well, none of the above. When reading from the prophets or the writings, a word-for-word reading was not required. The reader was permitted to extrapolate as long as they did not do what's called destroy the text. Remember when Yeshua said, "Do not think that I came to destroy the Torah or the prophets. I did not come to destroy but to fulfill." Well, that's what he was referring to. He came to interpret the Torah and the prophets and fulfill them by revealing their true depth and meaning. He was assuring people that he would not destroy the Torah or the prophets through his teachings. He would direct people to them, not away from them. And that's exactly what Yeshua did when he read from Isaiah in a synagogue. Well, the people of Nazareth had already heard what he was doing before he arrived. He was directing them to the messianic prophecies of Isaiah and letting them know he was fulfilling that prophecy. He was placing the focus on himself, and he was reading promises directly given to the house of Israel through Hosea. Remember those promises? He will heal us and he will bind us up. Well, this is not at all what the people of Nazareth were expecting. He was declaring himself to be the anointed one, the Messiah. They could not accept this. Here's their response as recorded in a typical translation. "And all spoke well of him and marveled at the gracious words that were coming from his mouth. And they said, 'Is this not Joseph's son?'" Well, the text could easily be translated that they witnessed against him. In other words, they marveled at all these grand words spoken by Joseph, the builder's son. Do you see the question in there? They were in disbelief. Who does this guy think that he is? We know him. He's just Joseph's kid. They weren't giving him a compliment. They were appalled at his apparent audacity to apply these verses to himself. That's why Yeshua responded as follows. And he said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Physician, heal yourself.' What we've heard you did at Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well." He sensed the sarcasm and disbelief. They were going to say, "Okay, big guy, if you truly are the one, show us what you got." Well, now it's no coincidence that Yeshua specifically mentioned Capharnaum. He had already been there healing, and it was actually his headquarters in the Galilee. Capharnaum literally means a town of Nahum. And again, recall that Nahum the prophet provided comfort to the house of Yehuda after the exile of the house of Israel by the Assyrians. But the house of Yehuda had just barely escaped the same fate, and many of their cities, like Lachish, had been destroyed, and they became a vassal state of the Assyrians. Again, the name Nahum means comforter. Nahum's message regarding the fall of Assyria came as a comfort to the Yahudim who lived in fear of the Assyrians. And remember that Simeon was awaiting the comforter of Israel. Yeshua was literally the Nahum of Israel, the comforter of Israel. Well, the condition of the Yahudim during the time of Nahum was similar to the condition when Yeshua arrived, only now Yeshua came as their king. But their days were numbered, even when Nahum was providing comfort. Likewise, Yeshua was providing comfort to those who would receive the good news. At the same time, he was pronouncing judgment while headquartered in the village of comfort, Capharnaum. So all this detail is critical to fully understand that Yeshua was saying and doing, but most Christians never learned it in Sunday school. Now consider the next words of Yeshua. And he said, "Truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown. But in truth I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and a great famine came over all the land, and Elijah was sent to none of them, but to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And there were many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. Well, they were already annoyed at Yeshua, and again, that was not the message they wanted to hear. What on earth was he doing using these foreigners as examples of faith? A Phoenician woman? An Assyrian general who was a leper? These are his pillars of faith. These are the exact people they wanted to replace and see judged. They hated these people. The people of Nazareth thought they were going to see all these good things described in prophecy and kick out the nations who had moved into Tyre, Sidon, and Damascus. They thought they were going to replace all these foreigners and see the destruction of the nations. Remember, they were an occupied people, and they wanted their freedom and independence. They sought revolution and retribution, and that's why many zealots were located in the Galilean villages such as Gamla. And an interesting parallel actually exists with how the Palestinians presently view the occupying Jews. And I use the word Palestinian in quotes because it's actually a label created by Rome when they renamed the land after the enemies of Israel, the Philistines. It was a slap in the face to the covenant land people, the covenant land Palestine, after it was named after the enemies of Israel. And it's clear error, since the Philistines were not even native Canaanites. They were not originally present in the land when Abraham was originally shown the land. They were sea people who came from the west later on. Some people allege the same thing with the Jewish people that are there now occupying the land. They say they weren't even original Yahudim, and we don't know for sure where they come from, or what their roots are. But anyways, so currently there's Arabs with ancient connections to the land who've lived there for centuries and who believe they're entitled to live there because of their heritage. And they think they're being occupied by a powerful military force that's continually raiding, arresting, and killing the terrorists, among them seeking liberty and freedom. And the irony is really profound, and in a real sense, history is repeating itself. Well, remember that the northern territories were allotted again to the tribes of the house of Israel, who are currently still in exile but scheduled to return in this oak tree generation. The Jews are claiming title to the firstborn by naming their country the modern state of Israel, the state of Israel. The name of the father goes to the firstborn, and the name Israel belongs to the firstborn bull, Joseph. And that's why the northern tribes were called the house of Israel. Those northern tribes, they carried the name Israel because of the firstborn status. Now remember how David ruled over the house of Yehudah for 7 years before the house of Israel joined the kingdom and anointed or Mashiached him as their king? He reigned a total of 40 years. We read about that in 2 Samuel 5, 1 through 5. Well, Yeshua came as the king of the Yahudim, and it's time for the house of Israel to submit to the king. Only Yeshua will reunite the divided kingdom. And I constantly warn people about trying to do that through man's efforts. This is something the Messiah's got to do. Well, the people in Nazareth wanted to hear a revolutionary message that led to the destruction of the Gentiles, the ouster of the Romans, and a complete restoration of the land to the Yahudim without the return of the house of Israel. Currently, we see Zionist Jews claiming all of the covenant land without being in the covenant renewed by Yeshua. They simply have no legal or even scriptural right to lay claim to the title or the land. If you told them that, I suspect you'd get the same treatment that Yeshua got in Nazareth. And what was their response according to the text of Luke? They wanted to kill him. It says, when they heard these things, all in the synagogue were filled with wrath, and they rose up and drove him out of the town and brought him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they could throw him down the cliff. But passing through their midst, he went away, and he went down to Capernaum, a city in Galilee. They were Yahudim occupying the land allotted to the house of Israel, and they wanted to be considered the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. They wanted to be the recipients of all the benefits that belonged to Joseph. They wanted that double portion. They wanted to steal his birthright, and Yeshua was getting in their way. Even though they claimed to know him, They tried to throw him off a cliff. Imagine the hate and the fury. Goes beyond just disagreeing with somebody. It sounds like how 10 brothers once treated their brother Joseph. Does this all sound familiar? Yeshua had destroyed their narrative. He diminished their mission and burst their bubble. They despised his message. They hated him and wanted to kill him. Again, sound familiar? Is history repeating itself? Because this is exactly what we see in the modern state of Israel. A nation that is really geared and opposed directly against Yeshua the Messiah. Well, Yeshua ended up leaving and returning to Capharnaum. And when considering the references to Capharnaum in the text, it's another Hebrew technique of focusing the message on the foreigners, as that message is bracketed by Capharnaum in verses 23 and 31. So, Yeshua went to the village of the prophet who declared judgment on the Assyrians, and he did the same thing to the Yahudim. Remember his words in Luke 10:13, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes." Do you see the significance of the statement now? In other words, you forced out the nations, and now you reject me. If they had stayed, they would have accepted me as the Messiah. So the overwhelming message from the birth of Yeshua to the beginning of his ministry and beyond is a message for the nations. We can definitely glean that from a proper reading of Luke. How many Christians have glossed over these passages with no clue regarding the depth of the message that the text contains? Well, this is because they have been taught a certain narrative like the people in Nazareth. The narrative then shapes their expectations. They think that the Torah is old and for the Jews as well as the land. They've been taught to hate their birthright like Esau. They are quick to sell their birthright to the land and privileges of the firstborn for a tasty morsel. The moral of the story is to be careful about your expectations. Truly get to know Yeshua and what he taught. Understand where and how you fit into his plan. And if you claim to follow him, then follow him. If you've been taught that the land and the Torah are only for the Jews, then you've been lied to. You have an enemy that is trying to deceive you and cause you to lose your inheritance. The enemy is a thief. If you think Yeshua is returning to rapture you so that you can live in heaven, again, you've been lied to. He's coming to claim his sheep and place them to graze in his land. You may think Yeshua is returning at a certain time and in a certain manner, but he may have other plans in mind. Yeshua shocked people before. He will likely do it again. He warned that only 5 out of 10 virgins will be ready when he returns. Why? Because they're wise. Hopefully, this exercise in examining a small portion of Luke revealed to you how much depth there is to be found in the Scriptures. Many of us spent our entire lives in church reading them without really understanding them. I dare say there are many Christians who claim to know the Messiah, but they haven't a clue why he came, what he accomplished, and what he's returning to fulfill. They're caught up in a religious fairy tale that cannot stand the test of truth, and sadly, there'll be the many who think they know the Messiah, but he'll declare that he does not know them. Why? Because they're lawless. And that's why I felt compelled to speak out in the last week's message concerning the so-called revival happening at Asbury University. Let's be honest. Gay seminary students and LGBTQ worship leaders are not the conduit for a scriptural revival. In fact, they're the reason for the impending judgment. Inclusion is only great when people repent, turn to Yahuwah, and follow his Torah. And I'm sure that statement would just enrage many people to think that they're not included because of their actions, but that is what the scriptures provide. So just like the inhabitants of Nazareth synagogue who heard Yeshua, the Christians at the Asbury Chapel are in for a big surprise if they think they can conduct a lawless revival. When it's all over, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth for sure. Therefore, as people run to and fro seeking an experience, I recommend that you keep the commandments of Elohim and hold fast to the testimony of Yeshua, not the lawless Jesus Christ promoted by Christianity. We're currently in the time described by Daniel when many shall be purified, made white, and refined, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. So be wise. That will ensure that you do not fall under the judgment that Yeshua is preparing to render upon the nations while he gathers his own. It says, Then I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he has a name written that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped with blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of Elohim. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of Elohim, the Almighty. Barakot. My name is Todd Bennett from Shema Yisrael. Shalom.